the market failure. And then, of course, one of the big things is the economic impact of climate change legislation. I mean, thousands of dollars per family are among the most common estimates for how much it's going to cost. And who's going to be most affected by these extra thousands of dollars that's going to cost American families each year? Is it going to be the wealthy? No. The wealthy, a few extra $1,000 here or there isn't going to hurt them. It's the poor. And I thought that, especially, it tends to be liberals who are the biggest on climate change. And liberals are the ones who are supposed to be looking out for the poor. Well, it's the wealthy have no problems throwing out these extra $1,000. But the way the climate change legislation is put in place, the poor are the ones who are going to get hurt the most. So why are we trying to do something that's going to hurt the poor when I thought that a lot of the people that support climate legislation also want to help out the poor? So maybe the climate change legislation could be changed to help out the poor, but that's something they have to consider. And another thing that maybe my opponents agree with is nuclear energy as a major source of getting us out of these CO2 emissions. Unfortunately, many on the left oppose the use of nuclear energy, but what a great opportunity that would be. France gets 80% of its electricity from it. I don't see why we don't harness nuclear energy. That's a great way to cut CO2 emissions, and we should definitely go ahead with that. And and again, going back to what the government does and why, a perfect example of government failure, it's been mentioned before, is the ethanol issue. I mean, this was the tell-all that we were told back in the early part of this decade. We're going to have ethanol. It's going to be this clean fuel. It's great for the environment. We've got all this corn, so we can become energy independent and good for the environment. But of course, what ends up turning out, it's one of the biggest debacles. Food prices soar, and as it turns out, the carbon emissions from ethanol tend to be just as high. So as using fossil fuels in many cases. So this idea that the government always has the right answer, we need to question that because the government doesn't always have the right answer. I agree that the market doesn't always have the right answer. So there needs to be interaction, but just to blanketly say that we should leave this thing up to the government is a big problem. And then, of course, this idea that that carbon, we should set an equal price for carbon so that it would say cost the same as, or we should put a cost on extra tax on say fossil fuels to make them cost around the same amount as I don't know, whatever the other forms of energy, wind, solar, all these great fuels for the environment. The problem is there's only one way you can make an equal cost that will allow us to purchase the fuels at the same price, and that's if they're all prohibitively high. And of course, the rich, well, it's not going to be too bad for the rich to pay that extra money. I mean, in fact, if all of a sudden we made gasoline $10 per gallon, of course that would do a great job to cut fossil fuel use. On the other hand, the rich would be fine. Again, it's the poor that are hurt. So I think we need to take into account the poor in this case. How can we, why do we need to hurt them with this legislation? And then just the last thing, it's been mentioned before, this is not the best economic time. I'm not a big fan of climate change legislation in the first place, but this debate is about should we do this in 2010. And after seeing how much of a government failure the stimulus package has been, do we necessarily go ahead and trust the government to take over our climate change legislation? And we have a big deficit, and it's just very hard for me to understand why during this terrible economic time we throw another burden on the American people with unemployment and everything. So it just doesn't seem practical. Maybe in a couple of years we can come back and debate this if that's what the other side would like, but why now? What's the big need?
Thank you very much. So why don't we take Teryn, why don't you?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you can articulate any significant economic strategy for the United States to actually compete with Asia, going beyond market fundamentalist ideology.
In what context?
Just can you articulate any national economic strategy for the United States to actually compete with Asia and stay on par with China, especially beyond simply free market, fundamentalist principles?
I'm not exactly understanding what. Are you saying how do we get a growth policy where we're growing at 8 or 9% a year as China is? Yeah. Obviously, that's impossible. China. I mean, anybody who studied economics knows that there's a technology frontier. Those countries who are already making the most amount of money will only grow at a certain percentage, 2 or 3% a year. And those countries that are below will have a greater chance to grow more rapidly because they can adopt the technologies already developed in the West. So I would agree with you. There is no way in the world we're ever going to grow 8 to 9%. If you can develop a way to make the United States grow 8 to 9%, and you can make a government policy that promises me to do that, maybe I'll change my views on whether the government should do that. But if you look at the European countries, which have a lot more of a command and control economy compared to us, European countries have been growing at a slower rate than the United States. You know, it's not that surprising. Obviously, the government tends to be very inefficient in what it does. And, I mean, the reason why China can grow as it is because it's so far behind. When China comes up close to the United States, if it can still grow at 9%, again, I would change my mind. But that's never happened. That the countries at the upper tier of countries, as far as I'm concerned, can never grow at that pace.
So in your opinion, the United States cannot possibly compete with China?
Hey, Teryn, we don't actually really have time for follow-ups, but you guys will be able to talk, you know,
Sure,
kind of unmoderated afterwards. So why don't we have one audience question,
Sure.
and then
I don't want to debate on your takes on climate change because you can easily Google it out and find that what you said was wrong. But I have an objection to the definition of poor, because I come from a country in which there are like 200 million people who gets to eat, let's say, once a week, luckily. And I guess it's the same with China. And the Himalayan ice is melting at such a catastrophic rate that it feeds 7 major rivers and it feeds 2 billion people. And by 2050, it will feed 3 billion people. So when China stops producing its rice due to the flooding and subsequent drying of its river, it's going to hold the United States ransom and asks the United States government to provide the rice for the whole 1.5 or 2 billion people. So don't you think it's a good idea that the US does something, to what your definition of poor is, let's compromise a little bit on that and look towards this bigger problem?
No, I think you bring up a great point, and I think China is a perfect example. Because, of course, as we know, China is the biggest emitter of carbon now, past the United States, and it's continuing to grow much more rapidly than the United States. And China has taken more people out of poverty. I mean, it's really a miracle what they've done. They've gotten hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, something that has never been done before in human history on such a large scale. How have they done that? Well, they have polluted the hell out of their country. They have polluted so much because they recognize that while it's great if we have all these clean technologies, and look, if we could have wind and solar and all these other technologies that produce electricity and all the stuff that we need at the same price that fossil fuels, I would throw away fossil fuels immediately. But China has specifically taken advantage of the cheap prices.
Who showed them the way?
Obviously, they followed a lot of what we did in the West, and because they followed what we did in the West, and because they went away from their command and control economy that they had back under the communists under Mao, and they moved to a much more free market system. That's why they're going at 9%. Do we want to put the Chinese back to stagnant growth and hundreds of millions of people starving to death? No, let's let them harness the free energy of the market and feed their people and stop a lot of these big problems that are affecting our world.
Okay, thank you so much for speaking. I'm going to let you know, maybe for the debaters, we don't really have time for concluding statements, so know that when you're speaking, it's going to be the last time your group is speaking.
Alright, so first I have a few factual disagreements. Number one, the poor are hurt the most by this. Congressional Budget Office report. The lowest quintile of American workers would see a $40 benefit from the American Clean Energy and Security Act. The next quintile would pay $3 a month in costs. The poor are not hurt the most by this. Number two, we shouldn't pass this in 2010 because we're in a recession. Congressional Budget Office. Shifts in employment would occur over a long period of time and we would not see immediate consequences. Number three, since 1998 we haven't seen much change in global temperature. NASA just last week came out with a study calling this decade the hottest one on the record. Number four, there is not overwhelming scientific evidence that climate change is man-made. Let's look at some scientific institutes that have said so. NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the National Academy of Sciences, the Environmental Protection Agency, American Geophysical Union, American Institute of Physics, National Center for Atmospheric Research. It goes on and on and on. You could list every major scientific institution in any country in the world, and they would agree with me because every scientist worth their salt thinks that. Anyway, now I'm going to get to my actual points. Okay, so what I'm here to convince you of is that climate legislation is not only a good thing, but it's absolutely necessary for the U.S. economy. And I'm going to do so by giving you specific examples. The first and most obvious place to start is energy efficiency. A McKinsey study showed that the U.S. economy could save $1.2 trillion by 2020 with investments in energy efficiency. It would reduce U.S. energy use by 23%. This money would go straight back into the economy, straight to businesses who would use it